Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. And I'm personally really excited about this episode. I think it's going to be one of the more interesting conversations that we've had on the show because we've done the thing that many UCP press secretaries said that we would never, ever do. And that thing is we've invited a conservative onto the show. So this is a conversation that I've been personally looking forward to for literally weeks now. And I'm very, very excited to have Jennifer Sanford joining us via Zoom from sunny, it looks like, Vancouver. So Jennifer, thank you so much for being willing to come on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. The only thing I'll say is that I'm not sure if I'm the type of conservative that the UCP wants you to pick.
Well, we have to start somewhere.
All right, you have to start somewhere, just baby steps, and I'm a good first step, yeah.
And I don't necessarily know that Matt Wolf or Brian Bateson would be willing to come and play, so this is a really good place to start.
Well, why not?
This is what I keep asking.
Yeah, why not?
So to start with, let's just do an introduction for our audience who may not have heard of you. Who is Jennifer Sanford?
Well, I'm an extraordinarily ordinary Canadian. That's probably the only thing you need to know about me. I'm a pollster's, magical wish. I just think like the consensus. I, act like the consensus. I'm just a kid that was raised in a bunch of towns in rural Alberta, who just really loves this country and is so proud to be from Alberta, despite where I am currently. And I've always been fascinated with the political process. My background is in public relations. I have a master's degree in political communications from Johns Hopkins and studied public policy at Harvard. And all of the things that I have learned, I've always learned through the context of how can I apply this to make the Canadian experience as fruitful for the next generation of Canadians as it was for me. I have a podcast, which I think we're going to talk about, called
Oh, yes, we are.
called Conservative Like Me. And the genesis of that podcast was really a love letter to Canada and a love letter to, what I hope it can be through the lens of my dissatisfaction with the state of our current politics.
Okay. Now, I took a look at your bio, and you have got some affiliations with some of the biggest names in conservative politics in Alberta. So you interned underneath a very particular premier. Which premier was that you worked with?
So when I was doing my undergraduate degree at Mount Royal in Calgary, I interned under Premier Ralph Klein, and I was in one of his ministries and had the chance to really see how his public affairs bureau ran. Not that I had a lot of comparable experiences, but it was a really tightly run ship, and two things really stick out for me. And the first was how important their internship valued mentorship. They wanted to be a capacity building organization, really committed to seeing a lot of students who were interested in political public relations come in and do good quality work. And the other thing was really access to the premier. In the time that I was an intern, I had great access to some of his extraordinary wisdom about, what he thought leadership was and what he thought courage was. And I think that those are two things that sometimes we don't remember about the premier that I think we should.
Okay. So just going through the conservative scorecard here, grew up in rural Alberta,
Yeah.
interned under Ralph Klein.
Yes.
So from the traditional Alberta conservative tiki boxes, you're hitting the big ones without question. So the next question that I have for you is, what does conservatism mean to you?
Well, I actually have to add one more tick box that we thought about talking about in the podcast, but it's important to remember that when I graduated from Hopkins in 2018 and came to BC for a little bit, I was asked to run in Scheer's federal election that year as a candidate. in a riding and opted to say no, and did so really because I couldn't quite find myself in his government, where I would fit, and just what seemed like an ask for cooperation that I just wasn't really ready to give. And so that's really where it began, my journey of saying, okay, if I'm turning down this opportunity, which lots of people just could not believe that I would turn, like I was plucked out of obscurity I wasn't part of an electoral district association. I wasn't producing thought pieces. I had just done incredibly well as a graduate student, and had, always had aspirations to make a difference, and had done so largely in the nonprofit community in Calgary. And so if you turn down this opportunity, then you have to really start to dig deep about why you did something like that. And that really began this journey of what does it mean to be conservative? And, I, like so many other conservatives, I'm a generational conservative. My mother and father were conservatives. And in our household, conservatism wasn't about someone getting ahead and someone losing out. Conservatism wasn't about someone having an opportunity for growth at the cost of somebody else. It was about how can the government have better interplay with the economy and the private sector and the market, so that the market can find opportunities for everybody, so that everybody can be lifted up. That prosperity isn't determined by what the government is able to provide. That prosperity is determined by everybody being able to have the highest level of efficacy about how they define prosperity. So, I'll often joke when people say like, oh my God, I can't believe you're conservative, which has such a stigma now. And I'll say, listen, conservative means that everybody has opportunity, everybody has growth potential, and everybody pays taxes because they have those opportunities. That we don't have to talk about things like inequality because everyone's being lifted. And it gives people the opportunity to then define for themselves what prosperity is. I have prosperity, therefore I want to give to social programming. I have prosperity, therefore I want to give to my neighbors and my community and locally. I have prosperity, therefore I'm going to hide it under my mattress. Hey, to each their own. I belong to the community-minded group because I was raised by a mother who taught me that if you have something to give, you have a responsibility to give that thing to the betterment of your community, whether that's financial support, encouragement, knowledge, that you have a responsibility as a human being. And I'm not sure how much that's a conservative value versus just a life value. So that's really how I came to be a conservative, looking at our financial responsibility. I live in, a panic that one day I'll belong to a government that runs out of money. I don't want that. So I think there's a lot of practical reasons that make me a conservative.
Okay. Now, in that what you said there, one of the things was making sure that everybody gets lifted. So, as somebody who identifies as a conservative,
Yes.
and this is an incredibly broad and probably unfair question, but what's your stance on social programs then?
Well, I think that, and this is an incredibly broad question to ask, and I appreciate you couching it that way. I think that when we look at market opportunities, we look at creating environments where we can drive important drivers into the economy. I'm constantly frustrated that we don't have enough ability to get women into the workplace. I think I made a joke in the podcast that don't talk to me about a gender balanced cabinet, talk to me about a gender balanced economy. Like that's the argument that conservatives should be making. I want to see greater opportunities for people to receive a qualified and affordable education, because I think that creates opportunities to lift people from poverty. And I just disagree with programming like, hey, because housing is not affordable, you can get a mortgage now and the federal government will be on that mortgage with you. So you can have a house because the government will lift you into the house. You can have food on your table because the government will provide a subsidy program for that. I think if the government can embolden an environment where the market can provide a place for people to have gainful employment, opportunities for advancement, educational and growth opportunities in a transitioning marketplace, then we can, is that sound my sound? I
don't
hear
think
a
it's
sound
mine.
like a plane going by. Oh my God, they're coming for me. I can't hide in the bunker any longer. The
You said
government
too
is
much already.
dissatisfied with this answer. If we can create all of those opportunities, then there's less of a lift on the part of the government to provide programming that needs to address those competencies. And so, it's for that reason that I really was a wholehearted supporter that one of the first things that Rachel Notley did when she was elected as the Premier of Alberta was to do a fulsome audit of the nonprofit community. I mean, people really don't talk about that, but she was really amply interested in, like, where do we have a duplication of systems? Where do we have a duplication of services? Are we streamlining? Are organizations focused on their outcomes? And I think that's actually, to me, a very strong conservative value. It's that, nobody should suffer in society. Nobody should ever be in a position where they're destitute and the only answer they receive is, well, I guess the market's not serving you. I mean, we're always going to have an element of social programming that we're going to need to address, certain nuances of society. AISH would be one of them.
That was one of the ones I was going to go to next.
Yeah, I hope we talk about AISH. So, we're always going to have those programs. But the robustness to which we have programs now tells me there's something else systemic going on. We're having less and less participation in the economy and in the marketplace. And I want to see that addressed. And I think that largely is the beholden mandate of a conservative government now.
So let's take a second to talk about AISH then.
Yeah.
One of the narratives that's been floated recently by the government, or certainly people working for the government, is the idea that AISH as a program is fundamentally flawed, and in particular in regards to who it serves and the number of people that it serves. The UCP, Jason Kenney's executive issues manager, Matt Wolf, came out and put out a tweet shortly after the whole debacle 2 weeks ago, where he specifically singled out mental health conditions that some members of the disabled community would probably refer to as invisible disabilities. That, in conjunction with the Premier's assertion that AISH has grown too big, there's too many people on it. What's your reaction to that?
So that is actually a big question, because there's three things we have to navigate there first. First of all, since the beginning of a two-party system, the difference between the two parties has always been that a liberal mandate in the spirit of a heavy-handed social programming is always going to develop a program that looks at a policy solution through the lens of undercoverage. We don't want people to be undercovered, therefore we're going to have a robust program. I hope we talk about CERB, because that certainly was the goal of CERB. Let's make sure we don't have people under coverage, as economists would say. On the flip side, conservatives have always been of the opposite mindset, which is, do we have leakage, right? Do we have leakage? Do we have people accessing this program that in fact should not be accessing this program? And in the province of Alberta, we have a state where, compared to other provinces, we do have a high number of people that are qualifying for AISH that's disproportionate to the total volume or total number or percentage of Canadians or Albertans that we have. So with any program that has that anomaly, you're going to want to say we need to investigate that, is there leakage? We need to investigate if there's an underlying problem. That's a noble goal, I think, of any government, to say, hey, listen, we pay for this program, we need to make sure that we don't have a high level of leakage. Once upon a time, that was an acceptable solution. But because we live in a world of polarization now, it's like, oh, great, you hate people who are disabled. You hate people with mental, we just drive that government further into corners, right? And so, first of all, I think that there's value in any program having an audit at any time. If it costs 3 times more to educate a child in this province, then we should understand the reasons why it is 3 times more expensive. Maybe we change it. Maybe we don't, but understanding the data in front of us should be a goal for everybody, regardless of your political affiliation. Now, and if I can just speak candidly, because I'm not a member of the UCP government, I made that comment earlier about I may not be the first one to go. I have no time and energy for Matt Wolf. I come from PR, I come from political PR, I don't get it. Whatever playbook he's playing on, no one else has access to that playbook. This is the challenge with this government, is that at a time where their strength needs to be feed forward, their deficit is becoming feedback to Albertans. And so rather than saying, hey, listen, we have to look at AISH and presenting all the facts about AISH and saying we're going to undergo a review, we appreciate that this is going to be an uncomfortable process. We appreciate for those people who are on AISH or who are part of a community that's supporting a person on AISH, that there may be a high level of disequilibrium. You may feel uncomfortable, you may feel nervous, but we're committed to transparency, and we're committed to something, like all of those things that they train you to say on day one of governance and day one of public relations. Instead, what we have is we're going to look at this program because it's broken, and we're just trickling out information. And again, this is occurring, and I hope we talk about this more, because we've allowed a current administration to not differentiate the difference between fighting for Albertans and fighting Albertans. We're like, close enough. Not close enough, and that will be held accountable. And I hope every voter, regardless of how they go to the polls, is mindful of how you hold that difference accountable. Because we are not a close enough province, and we are not a close enough nation. We are an incredible country and province, and we can get it right. So, that's the challenge there. So my personal belief on AISH is, of course, review it. Provide comfort to the people who this will create instability for. But if we open up a door to discover that, hey, listen, there's another deficit here that we need to address, or there's a systemic problem that we can address with different programming, then I think it's worthwhile. On the last topic you mentioned about anything discriminatory about mental illness, I have no time for. Mental illness is real. Mental illness impacts people. That's 2020 thinking. Let's all just get there on that.
I think one of the concerns, and certainly in the conversations that we've had with members of the disabled community through our little podcast here, one of the concerns is that the UCP government in particular seems to have established a bit of a pattern where they say a thing, and then they go and create evidence to support what they said in the first place, even though when you take a look at the quality of that data, it's not that good, or poor in many places. For the premier to come out and say, I don't know if they're that severely handicapped, and Matt Wolf to back that up with like, oh yeah, the ADHD, anxiety, that's not disabling. Before, as they say, and oh, by the way, we're going to conduct a review. I think everybody goes, oh, we know how this has gone the last every time that you've done it.
I like that, the last every time. I like that. We should put that on a shirt.
That'll probably be one of the lines we use as a promo. But that's one of my fundamental concerns, because there, of course, to me, there is a possibility that AISH could be run more efficiently. There always exists that opportunity within any organization.
That's right.
The concern that I have is that it seems like the delineating factors for how they're looking at this, based on what they've said, aren't evidence-based. They're not based on medicine, and they seem to be not based on how incredibly difficult it is for a person to actually get on AISH. While there may be, like I said, efficiencies to be found, I don't know that going after people who are suffering from mental illness is
and discounting it.
Yeah, that makes me really uncomfortable, because I when I'm not doing this silliness, I work in healthcare, and I see how debilitating some of the conditions that Matt Wolf listed off can in fact be. Sure, there's mild cases of anxiety, but there's also anxiety that is beyond crippling. And I personally get really nervous when this government starts to speak in these broad generalizations, because they're to some degree leading the conversation that way. It was stunning to me to watch how many people, after Matt Wolf put that tweet out, especially on Facebook. Twitter is a bit of a different place, but on Facebook, the number of people that were like, oh yeah, I heard about this guy and he's totally taken advantage of the system, and oh yeah, like he says he's got anxiety, but I don't know.
Why is that always the voice of conservatives? Why is that always
That's one of the things that I want to talk about.
These people who wandered out of the bush somewhere. Just can't believe it. What year is it?
Why are they being given the microphone? Because that's fundamentally what the UCP have a very clear established practice of doing is, and I mean, even some of the conservative media groups, they march out these folks that could not be more misinformed about the topic on which they're speaking. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, first, to just wrap up this AISH thing and then answer your question. AISH, so these conditions that Matt Wolf listed off, that's clearly not his lived experience, and I hope that there'll be a learning that comes from this. That one thing I know about communications people, regardless of their political capital or political affiliation, they come to see issues differently when they can put their loyalty aside. So that does bring me to my second point, which is really about loyalty. Listen, we all have different values that we bring to our lived experience, and for some people, loyalty to the group can hide a manner of all sins. We see it in the United States, we've seen it in other countries, and of course we're going to see it here in Alberta. People who are loyal to a conservative government are very loyal to that conservative government, and the more loyal you are, the more you're a trusted surrogate for that. I mean, I've had the same interesting experience where an NDP under Notley would have an idea, and I think this is kind of crazy. And then you'd see the surrogates that are like, no, this is perfect. And you're like, okay, well, I guess it exists on both sides. So obviously sometimes that can give way to the most fringe groups. And I think, and this is really the heart of where I hope our conversation can go here, is that at the end of the day, the challenge that I think is really happening with the conservative government here in Alberta is a challenge of adapted leadership. We seem to think that we can just solve all of these technical problems and that somehow equals leadership. But that's not going to fly anymore, because in the words of Michael Douglas, we have big problems to solve and we need big people to solve them. And what we're witnessing is really I think on both sides of the political spectrum, the picking of low-hanging fruit, and the assumption that that's somehow acceptable or tolerable for the position that we're in. We need to completely revolutionize how we do everything in this province. And we're incredibly alone in our pursuit to do it. And to see governments that are like, well, let's just fight about technical problems, I think is serving no one. And I think then the byproduct of that becomes, let me tout out my loyalists, let me tout out my loyalists, and we can let them go toe to toe. And what happens is that, paradoxically, those loyalists become the most fringe voices of the party. I know, and this is part of the reason I came out with the podcast, I know that there are people who think like me, but I can't find them. So I had a responsibility to put my voice out there. It's like when you're alone on a desert island and you're like, put out a radio call and you're like, does anybody hear me? I'm just hoping that people will come forward and say, I hear you. And you can create a community. But in our current political system, what is the benefit of being at the center of the spectrum? Right? What is the motivation to be at the center of the spectrum? When that motivation is lost, then you have, okay, well then let's just let our fringe voices speak on behalf of the party. So that's how that happens.
One of the things that we've been sort of exploring on the show to some degree is the idea that when we see these fringe elements taking control of the narrative, let's say, that more than anything is emblematic of a leadership vacuum. With the idea being that if there was real leadership, and there's many parties that suffer from this, we seem to push leaders forward that are the most appealing to the people who are going to be the loudest, and it's the loudest ones that are perceived, at least, to carry the most vote. I take a look at one of the things that we saw in the last provincial election, where there were extremely socially conservative groups who were not only putting forward candidates for Conservative nominations, but nominating and actively character assassinating ones that didn't meet their particular ideological goals. How does an organization like the Conservatives in Alberta, or the Conservatives at a federal level or anywhere else, or also different political parties, how do you think we get to a place where people who possess legitimate leadership skills and integrity, I think, is probably the most important thing, they get pushed forward instead of the ideologues or the floppy ones?
Well, I think that at this time in our history, we're really looking for people who are prepared to be a fighter. Everybody will say that. What are you looking for in a candidate? Well, I'm looking for someone who's going to be a fighter.
Well, that was their whole slogan in the provincial election.
Yeah, it's just this idea of a fighter. It's really hard to be a fighter when the opposite of that is to be someone who brings people along. Like, it's hard to be a fighter when you're really close to the center of the political spectrum. Especially when your opponent can just go deeper into their side and sort of, rally that base. We also have this fundamental problem with this issue of allies. Who are your allies? So, I've always been of the belief that allies are cheap. Allies are cheap. They amplify you and they'll motivate you. But I'm interested in a leader, and I think there's other people listening. I think you are one of them who's interested in a leader that doesn't say, my goal is not 51% of the vote. My vote is, how do I bring those 49% over to where I am? Mm-hmm. The way the system is currently constructed, it's about allies and the amplification of allies. And we've allowed outsider groups to influence that. And number one on my hit list becomes the social capital of religious groups. You are absolutely entitled to freedom of religion. I talk about this in the podcast. I got a whole episode about it, and I got a lot of angry email about it.
It was a really good episode from what I heard.
Yeah, many people didn't make it through the first 4 minutes, but they were angry at minute 4. And if you listen to the episode, you will know why. But they have tremendous social capital in terms of how they mobilize and get out the vote, how they do what they have always done and will always continue to do, which is to find, endorse, and fund candidates that respect their political ideology, which is counter now to the dominant thinking of Canadians and attitudes on Canadians. And so you have two conflicting things. One, you have candidates where we have 3 conflicting things. One, we have this problem with allies, where we allow that to think that's how you win an election. I don't think that that's political leadership. I think political leadership is about saying, how do I get that other side to come to where I am? How do I make a strong moral argument that they belong with me? And that takes incredible political courage to do. And the other piece is to really have transparency to the impact of this social capital. And so far, we've always been focused on dismantling. We've got to dismantle these religious groups. We don't have to dismantle them at all. This is their right under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. What we need to do is make sure that our voice is proportionately louder. There's more people that believe that we should have Conservative or NDP or Liberal candidates that believe these things, and we have an obligation to be vocal to find those candidates and endorse those candidates and fund those candidates and empower those candidates to run. And I'm sure there was a third thing, and now I feel like Dan Quayle because I can't remember it, but it'll come back to me, I'm
Quick,
sure.
How do you spell potato?
M-I.
I think one of the barriers to that, and this is one of the things that I'm trying to figure out myself, is you have, using religious groups as an example, you have religious groups that are incredibly organized. I've been bandying around a theory that one of the things that has, I'll use the word, hijacked the Conservative Party, certainly in Alberta, and there might be an argument for federally as well, is the fact that you have some of these religious groups, which I agree make up a very small percentage that's reflective of what Canadians believe or Albertans believe,
but have disproportionately high social capital.
Yeah, and the big thing that I see that they bring to the table is they are evangelical in everything they do. So you're talking about a demographic that has been in many cases raised from birth to believe that not only do they have to convince you because they want to be right, they have to convince you because literally everything rides on that. And so when you transplant these people from a theological space to a political space, they bring all of that passion. One of the big frustrations that I have with progressives in Alberta is you can have one of these evangelicals, whether we want to talk politically or theologically, I'm just going to call them evangelicals because I'm lazy.
Okay.
But you have one of these evangelicals, and if they're on the Facebook and if they're on the Twitter machine, they will show up for every single comment every single time. Progressives have this tendency of going, forget it then. And what that leads to is in the name of moral superiority, or I don't know what, progressives seem to be willing to back right off and just, I'm not going to engage with you. But they give up all of that real estate from here to here that other people are going to absorb. I think this is a big part of how we've seen the QAnon movement spread in the States, is that people have looked at some of the stuff that's come out of that and have said, well, that's clearly bullshit, and then walked away. And then these people who are spreading the crazy get all of this free space. And invariably what you're going to end up happening is people who are looking for something see that and go, yeah, I am getting screwed, and that looks like a good reason why. So how do rational...
Oh boy, be careful, you're going to get the same mail that I get.
I already get it. I don't go a week where I don't have a press secretary calling me names.
Oh boy.
But how do we get to a place where pragmatic conservatives such as yourself occupy more of that space than, say, we had this little thing happen in Red Deer recently, not once but twice, and those people are owning a lot of the perceived conservative airspace. How do you take that airspace back from them?
Okay, so a couple of things before I want to talk about Red Deer is, this is something my father and I talked a lot about as we were putting this podcast together. Was I had asked the question, is it as simple as the fact that, we don't, as progressives, all gather together every Sunday? Like, is this just a fact that they meet together and we don't? Is it just that simple? Because they get to reinforce, right? They get to
Yeah.
reinforce their values. They get to mobilize together. I personally have seen when ridings are looking to select a candidate, I'm seeing all the people come in and vote, and I'm thinking this is so exciting. And then all of a sudden, all these buses roll in, and it's just whole churches, and there isn't anybody missing, and they're all there to support their candidate. So they're incredibly well mobilized. But the thing is that our political system is established so that just because your voice is amplified doesn't necessarily mean it's the only voice that can be considered. And so, maybe while they have mass troops, progressives need to embolden themselves to have covert ops. Get into your electoral district association. You have a right to be there. Every riding has one. Get out in your community, and when you don't see what you want, run. Because people have a free vote, and you just have to do it 1-to-1 versus 1 to congregation. It's just a different way to participate in electioneering. But the way it is in certain pockets of this province and certain pockets of this country will continue until progressives are prepared to say, I can no longer be part of this. I can no longer be compliant or complicit, or I can no longer keep shopping around to the other parties that at the end of the day don't represent what I want for this province or this country. And so, there is a bit of harnessing the will of progressives, because we're loose. We're just out there. It's like me, look, I'm one, I got a parent, he's one out there. It's not like we all get together. We're just out there one by one. And, in politics, there's an expression called finding Brian, which is like, how do you find the one guy that is out there who will give you his vote, but you can't find him because he's not in established group places, which have a tendency to be far more conservative. But then there's also this issue of the will of the country, and I'll speak on a federal perspective.
Mm-hmm.
More and more the data is showing that we are becoming more and more progressive. We don't want to have discussions about abortion anymore. We need legislation, so we move past it for good. We need to stop having any discussion about which leaders are going to go to pride parades, because it's an assumption that they're all going to go, right? It's just like a moot point. We just kind of need to move there because society has moved there. And so, on a federal level, I've openly posited on my podcast that, you're going to have to get more progressive on these social issues, or you're going to get very good at being the official opposition. People are not going to come to play with you. And at the end of the day, we need governments to work together. Like at the federal level, I've often joked that Jagmeet Singh must wake up every morning and think, today is the life, big balance of power against Justin Trudeau, versus Erin O'Toole, who has significantly more votes in a conservative government, but nobody will play with them. I will always remember somebody asking Elizabeth May, who is a religious person and has a tendency to be more conservative than she'll lead you to believe, was asked in a press conference, will you work with conservatives? Just couldn't even wait for the question to be finished before she's like, no. And we can't have that. We can't have someone in the House of Commons where nobody plays with them, but that many Canadians vote for them. We just can't have that. So I'll be really watching what an Erin O'Toole leadership does about that, because if they don't get it right, we'll be right back to the table looking for a new person.
But it seems like that's already to some degree started. There was a question that came up last week where it was I'll call it a socially conservative issue. It wasn't logistically relevant to anything that's going on. And it was probably a little bit of a trap that was deliberately set to go, see, they haven't changed.
It was about conversion therapy. It was going to be the first bill of the new session to say, like, hey, let's see if we can trap them here. I think in a pandemic with such issues with our economics, I think that was a shit move on the part of the Trudeau government.
It was for sure a crappy move, but as much as it was clearly a trap, he walked right into it. I mean, that could have been a moment where he could have said exactly what you just said. This is not the time or the place to discuss these issues, particularly because they're resolved. Of course, we're against conversion therapy. Can we please talk about the economy? If he'd
That's right.
gone with a move like that, he would have massively increased his political capital. But
Mm-hmm.
instead, he did what he did.
Yeah, I mean, a disappointing day to be a conservative when you see things like that, because it is such an easy swing, and you stand poised at the TV and you just go, this is a softball, hit it as hard as you can. And instead they just waff on it and you go, well, now I have, my Twitter handle is conservative like me. This is going to be, and then people think that that I would think that. And, you know, those are hard days, but I know that the winds of change are blowing closer to my direction than someone who would have the audacity to say that conversion therapy somehow is a fulfilling experience for somebody, and can try to put an argument together about why that would be appropriate.
No. Why do you think that and we've seen it for the last couple of conservative leaders, where when they've been presented with these softballs, their reaction, as opposed to putting everything they have into swinging at it, has been to just sort of lean over and let them hit it in the forehead? Why do you think they aren't showing that kind of leadership?
Well, it's like what I talked about before. There's no incentive to come to the middle, right? I mean, if you stay entrenched in your base, I mean, people have built a brand around their base. And so to say, you know, we're gonna come to the middle, to some political strategists, of which I am not one of them, would say, well, this compromises your base. And also, I don't think brings people over to you. So there's no net win in supporting this or coming out against it. So stay where you are, stay neutral, stay with the party line. And I argue that that's a fallacy of thinking, because first of all, people deeply encroached in your base, and we talk about this on the podcast, if you piss them off, where are they going to go? They're suddenly going to vote green? They're going to go right to the other side of the political spectrum? Like they're not going to go anywhere. So it's time to negotiate with them. And the other piece of that is if you stand still long enough, waiting to stand for something, then standing for nothing and standing still becomes what you're known for.
Yeah.
That was the problem with Andrew Scheer. And if Aaron O'Toole has another one where he takes it on the forehead, as you said, then that will become what Aaron O'Toole is known for. And so I'll be watching. You know, I rarely make excuses for political candidates, but I really do feel for Aaron O'Toole's first month of leadership. I mean, he's like, they botched the leadership vote. He had to give an acceptance speech in the middle of the night. And the CBC was so, like, Rosie Burton looked like she had ridden a Six Flag roller coaster for 8 days by the time that announcement was made. They were exhausted. And, you know, then he gets COVID and can't go anywhere, can't even defend the throne speech. And so, you know, I think, you know, and then he whiffs it on this early issue. I'm really interested to see, once that train gets moving now with Parliament back in session, like let's just kind of see where the proof is in the pudding. So I'm tentatively watching, but what I know is that people like me, this is the last call at the bar. I'm angry about what happened with Andrew Scheer. That guy was a weird choice. From the beginning, he wasn't going to speak to conservatives. He ran an election that we didn't get. I think he harmed what it meant to be conservative. I put him in the same camp as Donald Trump. It just didn't get to the heart of what conservatism is. It tried to solve all these ridiculous technical challenges versus showing what adaptive leadership looks like at a conservative level. And if Aaron O'Toole can't get it, then I'm not, and I know I'm not alone. I know it's like me and 5 other people, us right. Progressive people. You know, we're really watching. So there's a lot of pressure on this to go the way it should go. And the fact that he wasn't selected over Peter MacKay, who showed early strides, you know, there's clearly people who were like, listen, we got to take a chance on a guy who's going to come straight up the middle here.
Let's move back to sort of the provincial realm.
Okay.
Because
I want Red Deer?
Yeah, you can talk about Red Deer. So before we get into Red Deer, there is sort of one thing that I want to sort of touch on, and that's the idea. I just want to highlight for our listeners. So far, we've had a conversation. I haven't called you any names. You haven't called me any names. So it's possible to have the. It's possible to have. It is early still. But I'm optimistic as you are about the conservative leader. These conversations are possible, and that's one of the big things that I'm trying to highlight, is that if you forego all of the fanatical assumptions, that's where some progress can be made in regards to political conversations. So that's my little plug in the middle there. So Red Deer's a great place these days.
Yeah, now we'll fight. Now we'll fight about Red Deer. You know,
Okay.
I deeply feel for what happened in Red Deer, because I think it was such a striking example of a failure of leadership on both sides. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. We as Albertans need to say that we demand more of our leadership, because two groups came together in a difficult way, in an angry way, in a wholly un-Albertan, anti-Canadian way. And one side of our leadership, the governing side, says very little and tries to pivot and distance and puff his way in and out. And the other leader goes and meets with one side. It reminded me of something that a professor said to me when I was at Harvard. And I actually wrote it down because I wanted to say it today. He said, when you dominate and you marginalize and you defeat a faction of your community in the spirit of creating real change, you generate a festering sword. You have to be mindful of that. The idea is that some win, some lose, and those who lose in the spirit of progress have to grin and bear it and go away. But that does not happen. They just download that bitterness and anger, and then they pass it on to the next generation. It never goes away, and the progress that you believe you've had is vulnerable. I support the progress of our society to embrace everybody and to have diversity and inclusion. I support that wholeheartedly. So do you. I see you nodding. But who was the leader who would say to the other side, what is this anger? Where does it come from? Why is it here? And how motivated are you to get rid of this anger? That, to me, is leadership. And when Rachel Notley just met with the one side that would earn her the most political will, and Janice Irwin, who I love her TikToks, but hated this tweet when she said, now that's leadership. That is not leadership. Leadership is about saying that does not resolve itself by amplifying one voice and telling the other side to be silent. We need to understand what is at the root of that anger, because we are not one-dimensional people. I don't think that there is a single Albertan over there, and we can try to do that conservative Alberta accent of, well, I hate this, or I hate. They're not that. It's not that simple.
No, it's not most Albertans.
This is coming because as we change, there are some people who fear a loss that will come from that change. And one of the things we never talk about is that one unsexy role of a government, we never talk about this, is that they have to be good at disappointing people at a rate that they can tolerate, right? We never talk about that. One of the reasons why so many people are angry about Jason Kenney is because it was too much change, too much, too soon. People on the other side had the same problem with Rachel Notley. It was too much, too soon. Disappointing people at a rate that they can tolerate is like the unsexy part they don't teach you in political governance 101. I would, while I don't want to get into the psychology of anger, and while I know that I'm genuinely risking trying to rationalize the disgusting behavior of that group, I want to understand what the anger was really about, right? We talked about good governance not just being 51%, but bringing that 49% along. What would it have looked like if Notley, who really desperately wants to be the premier again, said, I met with this wonderful group of LGBT people and two-spirit groups and people who want diversity and Black Lives Matter, and we had a wonderful discussion. And then I sat down with representatives from the group that was angry, and we had a discussion about where that anger is coming from. To me, that earns the Janice Irwin leadership tweet of approval. And I think that's the standard that we have to hold our leadership to now. It's about saying that we're not going to leave someone behind. And that traditionally was always a conservative value, is let's try not to leave someone behind. And then a liberal mandate was like, well, we define the not leaving someone behind as generating systems to not leave them behind. And so we always have that shared goal of not leaving people behind. So where is the leadership that says, I will be a governance that says we're not going to leave people behind? And that means having a lot of disequilibrium, having very tough conversations with our community, exposing warts and sores about our community that we have to face in the spirit of moving people forward. Because I'm not interested in just winning elections. I'm interested in being a politician for everybody. Where are those politicians now?
I think part of the challenge with that is that when you take a look at a lot of the social media, and we'll focus specifically on the Red Deer group, because I don't want to cast too broad of a net because we'll fall right through it. But when we're talking about the particulars of the group in Red Deer and the content that they generate through social media and the figures that are involved, I don't know that this is the leaders of this movement are
I don't know if you
people.
can call it a movement. I think it's just a gaggle of angry people that have found
I think
meaning
you
and
have
belonging with one another.
to call it a movement, because they do. You take a look at the friendly barbecue organizer, as Global so gracefully introduced him initially. He's a guy who was foundational in forming Wexit. He's a guy who's he has no hesitation in putting out xenophobic rants on the Facebook machine. He's a guy who embraces the yellow vest QAnon stuff. There's so much that's pushing behind that I think to not characterize it as a movement is dangerous. Now, I would not, to be clear, characterize it as a conservative movement, because I don't believe that it is. I think that it's a crazy people movement.
Very clear that is not. Although,
but I think,
although that is what a lot of what people believed.
But that's one of the points of correction that we have to be able to make as a society if we're going to move forward, I believe, because if we look at the Red Deer folks as representative of conservatives in Alberta, we are not only doing a disservice to a tremendous number of Albertans, but we're doing a disservice to the conversations that we need to have. Because yes. I don't know, I've had conversations with members of the Yellow Vest movement. I've tried to have conversations with members of the QAnon, I don't know what, and there is so much anger there. Yeah. But I always go, and I do this across the spectrum, regardless of who I'm talking to. I have a thing called that I call light bulb theory. And it's based on a joke that I'm quite fond of. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb?
How many?
Only one, but the light bulb has to want to change. And that's foundationally true for just about any kind of change that you want to implement. I look at how this provincial government has responded to the whole question of supervised consumption sites. And that's the piece that they're missing. You take a look at the actual data behind supervised consumption sites. Well, we know they save lives because no one's died in one in Alberta. We know that they bridge the gap between somebody who's lost in their addiction and getting them into rehabilitation. We know that they do issue provide pathways to get people into their conversion rates for getting people into treatment are actually impressively high. And we know that they have a net negative impact on the number of needles that are on the street because they take in more than they give out. And those facts alone, combined with what I would consider to be a moral imperative, but that's my personal thing, is to me plenty of evidence enough to go, these are good things, we should do them because that way people don't die. And it's also cheaper than sending them to the hospital every time they overdose.
And as a conservative, I start with the cheaper part. It yields an outcome, all the outcomes, but it's also a very affordable solution, and one that has good evidence and data behind it.
But the chief argument that the UCP have pushed back is that we don't want to be enabling these addicts. And that, to me, ignores the light bulb theory. Because sure, you can choose not to enable them and they'll die, or at least some of them will. But if you keep them safe until they're at a place where they are able to accept help, and that's part of the process. I mean, and when I've spoken to people who specialize in addictions, that's part of the process. You meet somebody who's deep in their addiction, and then you support them and wait. And if you do that in the right way for a good number of people, then you'll be able to get them into treatment. But if you just go, nah, figure it, make a choice, like it's that simple. That's where it falls down. And so to get back to the Red Deer folks, the challenge is that with the group that was instigating, there were people that were coming from across the country to, in their own words, knock heads. So when you have people who are coming from outside of the province to cause violence inside of the province, I don't know how you have that conversation if they're not willing to be open to the prospects of some form of change. I think it's good to understand what their motivations are, and there's certainly repeating patterns that exist on both of these groups. I don't know if you saw our interview with a particular left-leaning group. There's some challenges over there too, no question. But if you don't come to the conversation with a desire to say, here's what we want, how do we find something that works, I don't know that you can have much of a productive conversation. And so I would have been terrified let's flip the script a little bit and say that had Mr. Kenney decided to address either of these groups, I would have been terrified if he'd shown up to just the one. I mean,
yeah, so there's the other side of it, right? So the thing that we can't forget is that just because it might not yield us the outcome that we want, because we may not be able to get actual actionable items from both sides, doesn't mean we don't owe both sides. I don't want to say owe both sides. It doesn't mean that both sides don't need to be heard. You may meet with them and go, okay, well, this reinforced everything that I thought. But where is this anger stemming from? And you're absolutely right. I think that's an important part to add into this, is that they did come from all around. And when you start to see mobilizing, if you just then say, go away now, you create this ripple in society that you can't hear and you can't see, but could roar up at any time. And that makes me nervous. And knowing that as Canadians, we're pretty close to on the same page around a lot of things. I mean, we've been able to do things in this country that other countries would just simply never be able to imagine, that kind of progress and process to be able to do that. And so we're faced with a moral leadership challenge around factions that are angry. And what we choose to do with those factions is ultimately going to be an important decision. And what I'm concerned about is that we're confusing understanding what's going on with these groups that are suddenly angry, and on both sides of the political spectrum, and somehow being seen as trying to understand it, as condoning it, right?
Mhm.
You met with them, ergo you condone it. And I think that ultimately is what kept both leaders, Rachel Nolley and Jason Kenney, away from those groups. And I think that is not what the goal is here. I think the goal is to say, if we have unrest, we get to the root of that unrest so that we can get to the business of governance. And also the fact that we can get it out of the way. I mean, we have significant challenges that we need to address in this province. We need to get along to do it. So trying to look at that, but I just do think it's important that we differentiate the difference between trying to understand what's going on and somehow automatically being seen as condoning or complicit in it in some regard. I think that those are not the same thing.
Yeah. The stumbling block for me, using Red Deer as an example, is that when you have one side that has at points met the criteria for hate speech under Canadian criminal law, and another side, I mean, I don't like the sides thing. To me, the whole, should we have to have conversations about I would like it if we lived in a society where we didn't have to have conversations about systemic racism, because we didn't have to have conversations about systemic racism. Unfortunately, we don't live in that society because we do have systemic racism.
And we're always going to have tough conversations because we're an evolving society.
Absolutely. But I can appreciate the concerns around, I'm going to go listen to the people, or I'm going to go sit down for a meeting and listen to the people who straight up espouse hate speech.
Yeah, but keep in mind to be impeccable with my word. If 1,000 people gather together and one person says something that falls under the statute of hate speech, how do you know that represents the views of the other 999 people?
The concern that's fair. But the concern that I have with it is that the people that are going to sit down for the meeting are going to be the leaders of whatever that thing is. And unfortunately, with the leader of the group or the organizer of the group from Red Deer, this is a guy who's very, very good at saying, oh no, we just came to chat and work out our problems peacefully, and I don't know what happened. And at the same time, he's putting out social media posts where he's like, yeah, we got this guy who's like so excited to kick some ass. I don't know that you can have a sincere conversation about the issues with somebody who's willing to be as manipulative as possible to advance their own ends, whatever those ends are. And I think in my speculation is that with the guy who's organizing a lot of this stuff in Red Deer, this is somebody who really likes attention, and there's, I'm sure reasons for that. This is somebody who has a possibly
an inherent motivation. There's also an inherent motivation behind it. And so just because something might not be fruitful doesn't mean it's not worth effort. And if you can disarm this individual, you also disarm the other 999 people that stand right behind him. So that's the other side of that argument. But I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying is that if you amplify this voice in any way, then you're counterintuitive to your own goal. If you feel like you give a place or a platform for hate, then you're further away from the goal that you started. I hear all of that argument, but if you are successful and you get to the heart of anger that actually is being amplified by people who aren't marching, but who are starting to feel that sense of discord, you may actually wind up doing something that can really move society in a way that you hadn't anticipated. And I think that exploration is always a worthwhile endeavor.
I like the optimism, the concern that I have with it, and I know I sincerely do. The concern that I have with it is I take a look at recent examples where the government of Alberta has decided to level the playing field, and now we have Kean Bext as a accredited journalist in the legislature, and unfortunately the exactly, but unfortunately the effect of, okay, well, let's give all viewpoints a relatively equal footing. He calls himself a journalist, and his friends set up an association, so he must be a journalist. Let's let him into the legislature. That
Absolutely.
gives him a level of credibility, and it gives his organization a level of credibility. And given that they're a media outlet that directly tries to influence the outcome of the stories that they cover, that's a real dangerous move, and it legitimizes what they're doing. And when they're saying, oh, hey, we're trying, I mean, there's a very good reason why on our Twitter profile and on our Facebook profile it says not journalists.
Yeah, it sure
and,
does.
and that's because we don't pretend to be objective all the time. We're trying to have conversations, and we use whatever tools are at our disposal to do so. And sometimes that includes puppets. And I've never seen a journalist use a puppet. So we're not journalists. But it scares me when I could, having used puppets in this show, get accredited as a journalist in the legislature. That's terrifying to me.
Yeah, but that's
Because
a
when we
technical problem to solve, right? That's a technical problem to solve, to redefine journalism as X, 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 and X. That could ultimately be an activity that makes every journalistic medium better, right? That could even,
Yep.
solving that technical challenge could even address some of the systemic challenges that the Conservative Party has with the CBC, which is a growing concern for both sides. So, I mean, every challenge is also an opportunity to make it better. And I will admit to your earlier statement that sometimes I can be the Peter Pan of conservatism, which I've been called in the past. Like, Jennifer Sanford is like the little girl that will never grow up. And maybe that's kind of healthy
I
because
think it's
we're in
good.
a
And I think,
critical place right now.
yeah, I think we do need that optimism. The only other point that I'll make to that is there is a reality where proximity, I mean, I've been thinking about it as we've been talking, and maybe what Rachel Notley could have done is sent a delegation to go listen to these folks. I think that would have provided a bit of a firewall so that the proximity wouldn't have been as harmful. Because the reality is that for a lot of people, that proximity does equal legitimacy. It was like, I think a year and a half ago that Kean Bext snuck up on Rachel Notley and asked for a selfie, and she didn't realize who he was. And he used that as a talking point on his social media to say, look, me and Rachel, we're super tight. So, I'm legitimate now. And people bought it. And that's
So manipulative.
Oh, totally. But that's the game that we're playing now, unfortunately. And the concern that I have is that and I'll cut this both ways. In fairness, I'll say that I think that as much as it was clearly a bit of a political move for Rachel Notley to go and meet with the other side,
It was
perhaps
absolutely a
for sure.
her part.
Maybe it would have been better if she had sent a delegation to both sides. That to me is a solution that I think gets to the heart of what you're arguing for, and avoids some of the inevitable tomfoolery. Because if I think that if Rachel Notley had gone to the Red Deer folks, and sat down with them, I think that her political opponents would have used that at length.
Yeah, fearing political posturing is one thing, but being able to have that moral leadership compass to say, I want to understand all sides of an issue because that's what a leader is. That gets deeply into like my little base of progressive conservatives who can be swayed in another direction. A leader is a leader for everyone and doesn't back down from a challenge, even though it's uncomfortable or it may be baited by another party. Let's remember that we have to hold our political leadership accountable, that you can't be so busy trying to get your job or keep your job that you don't do your job. And hold people to account when they want to characterize it in a way that isn't fair. There's always that part. We always fear the public resonance of something. Coming back to Jason Kenney, my father and I were talking earlier about like what has been the challenge of his leadership, and I said I think the greatest challenge of his leadership, other than his ability to produce data that supports his own thinking, just to pause, I will say that I've mentioned that I studied at Harvard. I have to say that one of the faculty there said to me, I am so happy you're from Alberta, and I hope that when you finish this program, you go back and help Alberta, because they would be the type of, if Alberta was a student, if your government was a student, they would fail every paper because their sources are poor. And I felt like, oh God, that's the message of my home that's getting to the rest of the world. And it's totally true. As a public relations person, I think for eons we'll study what was the actual purpose and intent and outcome of the war room, and how something that was so engineered to help ultimately became such a collateral downfall for the government. But one of the things I hope that Kenney can figure out, or voters will hold him to account for, is how honest he needs to start to be about the trade-offs of this province. He needs to be able to say, we have to make cuts to keep something affordable. I'm hearing from you that you don't want that. So let's be candid with you. We can keep you at a 10% taxation rate, and we can do this, or we can have all of these things that you want, all of these things that the NDP government has promised you. We'll just simply move taxation to 25%. You good with that? And if voters are like, yeah, I'm good with that, then do it and move on and continue to govern. But you have to have a real conversation about trade-offs with Albertans. And that's the frustration that's happening. It's like almost they don't believe that Albertans are capable of having those conversations about the trade-offs that they're facing. If education and healthcare and economic stimulus and social programming means that we have to absorb a larger tax burden, then have that conversation with Albertans and let them make a decision on who they think should govern. And if Rachel Notley says, well, wait a minute, I can deliver all that social programming at only 22%, and people are like, well, 22 is better than 25, then elect her and then hold her to that 22%. And then when it's not delivered or the service delivery isn't, then we go back to the polls. And I think that is the type of like intellectual governance that I want to get to. Instead, it just seems like we're in this place where one party is the soul of a country or a soul of a province, and the other side hates you and hates themselves. That's one thing that drives me crazy about where we've branded conservatism today, is when people say like a liberal government or an NDP government or a green government want society to flourish, and a conservative government hates you and hates themselves and doesn't want to see anybody prosper but the 1% of people that look like them. And I'm here to say through my podcast that I reject that narrative, and I think we can shape a conservative party that can get away from that narrative for good.
So what would, and this is the question that one of the questions that I've been looking forward to asking, if you could design a conservative party, we do provincial politics, so we'll do provincial. If you could design a conservative party in Alberta, what would it look like?
Well, it would look like an olive tree, because you're going to need a hell of a lot of olive branches, right? We have large pockets of this province. I call them Edmonton. that are very very progressive, right? And so I think if you want to hold a government mandate with a strong majority in the ledge, then you have to be able to say transparent financials are very important. And we're going to look at everything through the threshold of what we can afford. And by affordability, I don't just mean by the budget that's created by the government. I mean by a tax threshold that that voters will be able to assume. Like, okay, listen, we need, like, you work in healthcare, so if you're like, we need massive expenditures in healthcare, and so we're going to have to move the tax burden to 22%. But if we if we do a little bit less of this, we can move it down to 18. I think we have to have this sliding scale transparency around, can we afford things? Because, under the Notley government, we're looking at, a huge expenditure of cash that was spent to help, short-term prosperity, but didn't move our momentum anywhere. And so I think you have to have a certain vision of being momentum focused. But as I talked about in the podcast, I think that a truly bold conservative government in Alberta is going to look at saying to the federal government, we're going to control the outcome of taxpayer dollars. And we're going to implement a PST. And we're going to use that PST for infrastructure, municipal spending, and social programming. We're going to dream big. We're going to have the Disneyland of provinces. If we're so isolated, we might as well make it a fun place to be. And we're going to have some generating revenue income to be able to do some things that really support some innovation. I talk on the podcast a lot about innovation and intellectual property. I think we should be looking at our universities as creating products and ideas that we sell to the world. And if it's about oil and gas extraction and refining, fine. If it's about tech, if it's about something else, I think we need to look at our intellectual property. And I think we need to start right away with a mandate that says we're going to open up every possible spot that we can for Alberta's young people and people in career transition to get a wonderful, affordable education. I think if there's any place where government should be putting subsidies and spending, it's in education. The smarter a province, the more we are capable of truly inspirational and aspirational goals. And I think that there are not enough seats for Alberta kids to get an Alberta education. And I like the idea of being a province that isn't afraid to say, and I have to be really careful because this sounds a lot like a Trumpism with a different hat on. And I'm not a big hat wearer, let alone a red one, but it's an opportunity to say, be born here, grow up here, educate yourself here, innovate here. And I think that there's something really bold about an insular strategy, because what we're seeing now is a premier who has his hand out to the federal government who says, like, we are not buying what you are selling. We don't want it. So it's like a relationship. We just need to say, like, excuse me, when it comes to the prime minister, he's just not that into you. And so it's time to date someone else. Why don't you try dating some of the people who live, date your constituents in your province. My father, who appears on the podcast, talked a lot about a provincial pension plan. More and more I support that. I think we should own how we invest our dollars. I think we're smart investors. And I think that puts us in a position of ownership that we've never really had before. And it gets us ready for the biggest challenge we have, which is that we need to have bite. And I think all of us on the political spectrum need bite. I think even Rachel Notley's governance was largely defined by bite, and she's going to try to run a re-election that her bite is bigger than Jason Kenney's. And so what does that bite look like on interprovincial trade, right? We make a joke on the podcast that, we can't seem to get our pipeline in. Okay, well, we won't import your wine. Yeah, I know we're going to bite back harder. If they need jet fuel, they're going to pay for it. And the same thing with Quebec. If you're doing it with us, we're going to make it hard to do a deal and start doing deals with some of the southern provinces of southern states of the United States. Make trade deals that work for you. Something that happens when you isolate off a province, and I'm well on the record for believing that Alberta has been isolated, is that you have two choices. One, you can ask for a place in Confederation, or you can say, well, then I'm going to start to do things that really work for my province. And again, if you're someone who's listening to this podcast and says, listen, I was out when she started to talk about looking at social programming differently. Think of the amazing, awesome social programming that we could have if we have everyone participating in the economy. We have revenue generation coming in. We're not beholden upon other provinces or a federal government to have caveats of how we spend our money. We're innovating, we're becoming educated. Think of how we push people out of poverty then. Not out of poverty, up out of poverty. And think about the types of supports that we're able to provide. We started this conversation by talking about AISH. Well, AISH program will never not exist. It may have many other names. We'll always have to support people. But what other programming can we put in place to be the most fulsome province where people say, we, it's not just an AISH payment, it's also support programming, counseling, community support, other health challenges. I used to work for a company called the Alex Community Health Center, and they used to say, if someone comes in 5 times in a year with a sore throat and you give them antibiotics every time, you're a bad doctor. If you ask the underlying cause of why they continue to be sick, if you make sure that their nutrition is good, you're serving the whole person. And maybe that just got into my bones, because now what I'm thinking about is that I want a province that serves the whole person, all of us as whole people. And so that's what I'm looking for in a government. And then, of course, I talked about olive branches, because we do have people who have really progressive and left-leaning way of thinking, and you need to put out an olive branch to say, join advocacy committees, join groups, produce reports and ideas and policy solutions that address these things that really fall into the blind side of a conservative government. Use your strengths to help us.
If you could change 2 things, I always get told to do things in 3s, so let's do 3s. Okay. If you could change 3 things about how the current Conservative government is running their business, what would those be?
Well, it's hard because I've talked so much about leadership, and I feel like if you're listening to this podcast and you take a shot every time I said adaptive leadership, you're drunk now. So, I really will focus on Jason Kenney as the leader, because I think a leader shapes a party. Not entirely, but a leader does shape a party once elected. And so the first thing would be, we've got to get out of this paradigm of feedback, like making a decision but not providing all the information up front, and then trying to explain it out the back. I think not only are you wearing out PR people, which I got to stand for my PR tribe, right? Not only are you wearing out PR people, but you're making it very easy to polarize people, because then they can just look at your sound bites and say, yeah, not for me. And overall, you hurt conservatism as a whole. And that's where the buck stops with me. So this poor communication up front, what I call the lack of feed forward versus feedback. When your partner walks into the room and they go, we have to talk. Yeah, that's feed forward versus like saying something angry and then having feedback at the end. So we need a little bit more of like, we have to talk. The second thing I would say is that there needs to be more of a challenge to the opposition to say, present ideas and solutions, then work alongside with us. Don't make the singular focus trying to defeat us in the next election, because we have big problems to solve. So putting together bipartisan committees to look at issues, especially when there's so much expertise on the other side. Like, tell me what group that's going to focus on diversity and inclusion shouldn't also include people who belong to the LGBT community it shouldn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, you bring that expertise. So absolutely extending more olive branches now to say, we need to work on bipartisan initiatives where we can show Albertans that we're on the same page on a few things. And the goal is not, political volley. The goal is to show good governance. And then I should have started with this one, and this will be in the promo, I can tell already, is that, sometimes when you put on a cowboy hat, you think you're going to be Ronald Reagan, and sometimes you're just a cowboy. And I think I would like to see him stop being such a cowboy. I think being impeccable with his word, being a statesman, I think we're so overdue with that. I talked about it earlier. There is a difference between fighting for Albertans and fighting Albertans. Efforts that you do just to rally your base come at the harm of good governance. And I think that we need to hold every political party to account for that, but especially at a time where we really are trying to figure out who we are alone. We need statesman-like leadership to do that. So
who was the last one?
What's that?
Who was the last one? Like, I'll cast a broad net on this one.
Yeah.
Do you think that Alberta has gotten the leadership that it deserves in the last 20 years?
Well, that's different to every person, right? I
I'm
mean,
asking you.
yeah, it's different to every, but I will say that, like, I'm not going to speak for all Albertans. I just have to speak for myself on this one. I I do think that Ralph Klein really was an important, I'll say important, uh, premier for this country or for this province for two reasons. The first, he was horribly fallible. Like, he would just pull stunts that we just go, "Are you kidding?" And then his popularity would go up. But you always knew where you stood with that guy. And you always knew that he was fighting for Alberta. And you knew that even if it was going to be uncoordinated and deeply unsexy, that he was going to go into every meeting and know that he was going to fight for Albertans. And one thing that struck me that I think really changed the trajectory of my life was an understanding that he always believed that Alberta's best day was ahead of itself. And I think now we're in this terrible paradigm where we believe that the best was yesterday. And that's hard when you want progress. And there's a large contingent of Albertans that want a lot of social and economic progress. So I think, that was certainly the last one. Now, that's such a biased answer because nope, you got to go out, you got to work for nonprofits, you got to get out, you got to work for industry, you got to make your money, learn your skills, get educated, and then you come on back into government and do your job. And I think maybe that was bad advice because we have such a systemic problem of establishment people in the parties, people who are like, I've been in this party since I was 18. It's really hard to crack in. I'm 37, and it's been very hard to crack in now, coming out of industry and coming out of other pursuits, to come back into politics, to try and say, like, okay, can we just kind of take the reins of this for a little bit? Because I think there's more people that think the way I think than what the current government does. And it's very difficult to crack in, but we need that. We need to see people be mobilized, get in your riding associations and in your electoral districts. And if you don't like what you see, don't get on Twitter and be angry. Find a candidate that represents your views. And if you can't find a candidate that represents your views, be that candidate. And then the other thing I would say, because I'm sure you want to wrap this up, is stereotypes do not define what we are. One of my very favorite Calgarians is a woman by the name of Anna Murphy. And I love Anna. To me, like, my big beef with Anna Murphy is that she's going to run for Calgary City Council, and I think she belongs in the legislature. I think she belongs in provincial politics, because when we talk about adaptive leadership, she's what I'm talking about. She is an extraordinary individual who has the capacity to really bring people alongside. She's got good economic ideas. She's an incredibly balanced individual. She's progressive. She's as liberal as you're going to find someone to be. And I'm often struck about how people are like, what an unlikely duo the two of you make. I mean, you're a deeply conservative woman and she's a trans woman. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, I don't think either one of us are defined by those identities. When Anna and I speak, we talk about the same things. We talk about the potential for Alberta. We talk about innovation. We talk about educating people. We talk about bringing people together. We talk about economic stimulus. We talk about all the same things. And so I hope that for people who have heard this interview with you and are considering listening to my podcast, Conservative Like Me, available on iTunes
and
now.
It's really, really good. Like, I said this before we started doing the podcast proper, but I'll say this to our audience of two people right now. It was probably one of the best podcasts that I've heard ever. And secondary to that, for people who believe that you can pigeonhole people because they identify as conservative or NDP or liberal or whatever, this podcast that Jennifer and her dad put together flies in the face of that. And I think that people would really be doing themselves a service to listen to it, because one of my big things, and I try to apply this to politics as well. There's a guy who used to be funny named Dennis Miller, and he had a great expression that he used, which was, why hate somebody on the basis of their race, religion, sexual preference, sexual orientation, or any of those things, when if you just take the time to get to know them, you'll find so many good reasons to hate them. And that's, I think, if in our conversations in politics, if rather than taking a look at somebody and saying, oh, you're conservative, therefore I don't like you, we took the time to get to know people, we would really be moving the conversation forward. I don't dislike Matt Wolf because he's conservative. I dislike Matt Wolf because he treats people really badly.
Yeah, and that's an important difference, right? That's an important difference. I feel that same way about, people across the political spectrum. I'm not going to have a sweeping assertion that because they have one political affiliation, they are what they are. And that certainly wasn't the spirit of the podcast. The reason why I created Conservative Like Me is because, yes, I wanted to find my tribe. I wanted to know that if this all goes to shit, that I at least tried to talk about what I believed conservatism is. But most of all, I wanted to give people who have pigeonholed conservatism by what fringe group says it is against what I believe the future of conservatism is. I'm interested to return to season 1 in 10 years and see if what I had imagined is ultimately what was envisioned. I mean, could I possibly be the Nostradamus of the conservative party? We'll find out.
I do honestly hope that you do a second season. I know that there was a goal on your Twitter account. Whether or not you would achieve that goal, I think really should be irrelevant to whether or not you do a second season, because I do believe that it's conversations like the one that you and your dad, the many conversations, the plural of the word, that you and your dad had on that podcast are conversations that are not only important for us to figure out where we're going as a province and a country, but also they're the start of a roadmap to how to be able to have these conversations. And I think that it's really, really important that we remember as a society, municipally, provincially, federally, that we're all people. We all have differing views about differing things, and that just because somebody identifies as a conservative, or like I said, whatever, that doesn't mean that they're not really important to listen to.
I think it's important to remember that when it comes to the state of discourse, citizens lead the way of their governments. If we can learn to have a high level of discourse, it gets very easy to expect the same of our leadership. And if we want the dialogue to change with our leadership, which I think is a goal that you and I share and other Canadians and Albertans share, then it starts with us.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for sitting down for as long as you have. These things never run short. That's what we're famous for, with our audience of 2. But
stop it. I know you have a bigger audience than 2.
Well, I think humility is important. But yeah, like I said, I cannot recommend your podcast enough. And I look forward to hearing what your future conversations are going to be like, because to a commentator and a satirist like myself, I found they gave me a disturbing level of hope for where our conversations can go. So thank you for that.
Disturbing level of hope is also going to be my Tinder bio, I'm pretty sure. There you be.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the conversation before we...
No, I think this was fun. Thanks for having me for 2 whole hours.
Thank you. And I hope that we can have you again, because I suspect that the conversations around politics in our province are only going to need to be more measured, and people are going to need reminders of that. And I think that the work that you do is a good reminder.
Well, thank you for that. And yeah, I hope we can work together again. And and I will pass along to my father the thoughts that you had on the MAID episode. I know that meant a lot to us.
It was, if you're going to listen to one of Jennifer's episodes, don't start with that one, because it's so intense and honest, and I want to use the word raw, that it's work your way to it, but good God, get there.
Yeah, there's a reason why they're numbered. Yeah. We take you on a journey. Follow the numbers.
Yeah, really though, do.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, please consider signing up as a monthly supporter at our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. And if you're listening to the audio version of our podcast, please consider leaving us a review and a rating. And don't forget to like and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at The Breakdownab. Thank you for your attention.